Are you ready for the word?
Yes, sir.
Turn to Genesis 13. Back in the 70s, there was a television show known as YAHWEH. Country music, comedic skit type of show. And one of the skits they would oftentimes do had a guy named Archie Campbell playing a doctor, and his remedies for his patients, to say the least, was unconventional. But one of the remedies, his go-to remedy with patients who came in, was where they would simply do, the patient would come in and say, "Doc, it hurts when I do this." And he'd say, "Don't do that." That silly line came to mind this past week as I reread Genesis 13 and looked at Lot's life and how from Genesis 13 on it spirals out of control. He kept doing things that were hurting him, and I kept thinking he needed somebody to tell him, "Don't do that. Don't do that," because he just kept making the same wrong decisions over and over and over. The decisions he made hurt him. That hurt him are worth us taking the time to look at, to list, to analyze, because number one, we don't want to make the same mistake he made. Why should we, if we can learn from him how destructive these kind of mistakes can be, why would we want to make the same ones? Number two, I want us to look at it because we need to remember that being righteous doesn't mean that you can't be wrong. Lot was a righteous man. Let me read this to you out of 2 Peter 2. We quoted it, I think, last week, but let me read it to you. 2 Peter 2:7. Yahweh delivered just Lot, vexed with the filthy conversation of the wicked. For that righteous man dwelling among them and seeing and hearing vexed his righteous soul from day to day with their unlawful deeds. Yahweh knows how to deliver the godly out of temptations and to reserve the unjust unto the day of judgment to be punished. So in verse 7, Peter called him just. It's the exact same word that in verse 8 is going to get translated twice as righteous. So in verse 7 he called him just. In verse 8 he called him righteous twice, and that word means holy or innocent. And then in verse 9 he called him a godly man. And a godly man, that word there means one who has great reverence for Yahweh. That's how Peter described Lot. His reverence for Yahweh is shown in that the unlawful deeds of Sodom vexed his soul. That's how righteous a man that he was. So we need to make no mistake about it when we talk about Lot. He was a righteous man who hated iniquity and who had great reverence for Yahweh. But there is also no denying that this righteous man made some very wrong decisions. Not unholy, not unrighteous, not against Torah, just wrong. Therein lies the lesson for us. Just because something we choose to do is not unlawful or unrighteous doesn't mean that it cannot do us harm or that it cannot be wrong. It's my hope that the point I'm attempting to make will become more clear as we look at the wrong decisions Lot made. So let's go read our text, Genesis 13. And though we read this passage last week, I want to read it again because the word's alive and powerful. And when we read it, it has a different effect upon us than if we just talk about what's there. So look at it and let's read it together here. Verse 1. Abraham went up out of Egypt, he and his wife, and all that he had, and Lot with him into the south. And Abraham was very rich in cattle, in silver, and in gold. And he went on his journeys from the south even to Bethel, unto the place where his tent had been at the beginning between Bethel and Hai, unto the place of the altar, which he had made there at the first. And there Abram called on the name of Yahweh. And Lot also, which went with Abram, had flocks and herds and tents. And the land was not able to bear them, that they might dwell together, for their substance was great, so that they could not dwell together. You know, Lot's dad died when he was very young. So where do you suppose that Lot learned how to accumulate assets and to become the wealthy man that he was? It says there his substance was great too. Who taught him how to think and grow rich?
Abraham.
Abraham did. That's right. Keep that in mind. Verse 7, there was strife between the herdmen of Abram's cattle and the herdmen of Lot's cattle, and the Canaanite and the Perizzite dwelled then in the land. The Hebrew word there, translated strife, comes from a Hebrew word that refers to grappling, wrangling, or wrestling. It was many years ago, but I still remember those days of being on the wrestling team in junior high and high school. The wrestling practices were grueling, far more demanding than any football practice could ever be. A 6-minute wrestling match, if you were facing a worthy opponent, a 6-minute wrestling match would fatigue you more than playing 3 football games back to back. It takes every fiber of your being in a wrestling match. So I find it interesting that the Hebrews used a word that referred to grappling and wrestling when they talk about arguing with one another. Strife. Quarreling, just like wrestling, can weary you. Our one thing, wrestling wearies the body, but quarreling wearies your soul. Hesitant to share this, but I will anyway. Meatloaf has a song. I ain't going to tell you which one, but he has a song. It begins with these words. Baby, we can talk all night, but that ain't getting us nowhere. I told you everything I possibly can. There's nothing left inside of here. And then another line in the verse says, I'm tired of words and I'm too hoarse to shout. Now, that's a man who's tired of quarreling, arguing, right? Quarreling, arguing, discussing, talking about the same old day after day wearies one. At least it's wearisome to most of us. But yet we have to admit that there are some people who thrive on it, who love it. It's like a hobby to them. If you don't believe it, post something on social media. There are people out there who are called trolls that are just there to argue with you about stuff, right? Way before social media, I learned it. It took me a while to learn it, but I learned that Marie's dad would enter into a discussion with you just to find out what you was passionate about so he could take the other viewpoint. He loved to argue. I may have shared this years ago, but within a few months of being married, we went over there to their house. And the custom when you go into their house was Marie and her mother and anybody, other woman that's there, goes down the hall and into the kitchen, and that's where they go. So she went down the hall and into the kitchen. They sat around the kitchen table and talked. That left me in the living room with him. I was sitting on the couch right at the edge of the hall. And he was over there in his lazy boy reading. Fine, I'm just sitting there. But finally, he closes up what he's reading. He set it beside his chair and he looked up and he said, well, that settles it. Adam and Eve came over on a spaceship. I said, no, sir. They did not. Well, I just read it right there. National Enquirer. So it must be so. And he said it real serious. I said, no, sir. They didn't come over on a spaceship. He said, it's right there in black and white. Just as adamant as he could be. And I said, sir, if you believe that, you're ignorant. Now, if I were to ever write a book on how to proceed cautiously through life, in my top 10 of things would be never tell your dad-in-law he's ignorant. At the time, I didn't know that. I actually gave him an out. I didn't call him ignorant. I said, if you believe that, you're ignorant. I did not know that man could move that fast, because usually when he got up out of his chair, it was all he could do to pull himself up. But he came up like a cat out of that chair. And he squared off at me and he said, get up, you little blankety blank blank blank. I'll show you ignorant. And I'm just sitting there looking at him. I thought we were having a discussion. I said, get up. I leaned across the arm of that couch and I said, hey, Marie, we need to go. That's right, you better go. And he commenced to a bunch of other words. What's going on? We need to go. Come on. Anyway, I later learned he loved to argue. I think he still does. I don't really know. But there are people who thrive on that. You understand? But strife's not good. The Bible says where there is strife, there's confusion and every evil work. Contentious people make life miserable. We're told that Lot's herdsmen and Abram's herdsmen were in these verbal battles day after day. The same old arguments every day over the same old garbage and nothing ever getting resolved. In a situation like that, eventually you get to where you hate to open your eyes and start the day because you know that you can't just go out and tend to your sheep and watch them graze and enjoy the sunshine and feel the breeze. You dread waking up and going to work because you know you're going to end up in a verbal battle with the same people you was in a verbal battle the day before. So Abraham knew he had to do something to fix this because every day had become a dread for the men that worked for him. So in verse 8, Abraham said to Lot, let there be no strife, I pray you, between me and you, and between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we be brethren. So Abraham's requiring that something be done. He had the wisdom to know that, number one, his men could not continue to work in this hostile environment. And he had no intention of sitting still and doing nothing to stop it. He was going to do what he had to do to shield those who worked from him from the misery they were in. Number two, he also knew that this was going to spill over to where he and Lot were going to be word wrestling with one another. Yeah. That's our new word. Instead of arguing now, we word wrestle. Abraham's peace and tranquility meant too much to him to allow it to be jeopardized by a spillover from the herdsman's conflict. And Abraham's servants meant too much to him for him to do nothing to protect them from these word wrestling tournaments that were taking place every day. So he offered a solution, and it's found in verse 9. Is not the whole land before you? That's a great question, isn't it? We could phrase it this way. You don't have to stay here. Separate yourself, I pray you, from me. If you'll take the left hand, then I'll go to the right. Or if you depart to the right hand, I'll go to the left. Verse 9 is one of the nicest ways ever that anyone has told somebody else, go away. That's what Abraham did in verse 9. He said, Lot, go away. I love you too much for you to stay here. You got to go. And Lot lifted up his eyes and beheld all the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere, before Yahweh destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, even as the garden of Yahweh, like the land of Egypt, as you come unto Zoar. Then Lot chose him all the plain of Jordan and journeyed east, and they separated themselves, the one from the other. Abram dwelled in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelled in the cities of the plain and pitched his tent towards Sodom. We talked about this last week. Toward means as far as, so he pitched his tent as far as Sodom. He dwelt in the cities, and he dwelt in Sodom. Verse 13, but the men of Sodom were wicked and sinners before Yahweh exceedingly. So, we've established Lot was righteous. There is no denying that. But these verses list at least 5 wrong decisions that he made. 5 wrongs from this righteous man. Not unlawful, I want to make that clear, not unrighteous, just wrong. And because they were wrong, they hurt him. They didn't hurt his relationship or his standing with Yahweh, but they hurt him and they hurt his family. And that is, to me, a very sobering thought. You can retain your righteousness and at the same time make decisions that hurt you and hurt your family. So here we go. Decision number 1. He was wrong to not restrain his herdsmen. Number 2, he was wrong to not seek another solution with Abraham. Number 3, he was wrong to not show respect to and defer to the man who had sustained him from a child. Number 4, he was wrong to focus on the material over the spiritual. And number 5, he was wrong to go into Sodom. So let's quickly go over those 5 things he did wrong. Number 1, wrong to restrain his herdsmen. The Apocryphal writings tell us that the strife was caused by Lot's herdsmen. Do you remember what the Apocrypha tells us that Lot's herdsmen were doing? Anybody remember? The Apocrypha tells us that they were trespassing. That's the reason it mentioned the Canaanites and the Perizzites. They were trespassing on their land and allowing their sheep to graze where they weren't supposed to be grazing. They understood the power that Abraham had, and no matter how upset anybody became at them because of Abraham, they weren't going to stop them. But Abraham's herdsmen didn't like this thing they were doing, and it caused strife. It was arguing that was taking place. But I share with you that even if we didn't have the Apocrypha, and even if we didn't know that, we can read the text here and know that if there was strife between the two, it was Lot who should have done something to eliminate it. Abraham was his elder. Abraham had taken care of him when there wasn't anyone else to take care of him. Abraham took on the responsibility of raising that boy, even though Abraham didn't have to take on that responsibility. Lot's many blessings are a direct result of his association with Abraham. By turning a blind eye to the strife, he became blinded to the value of the relationship that he had. Word of Faith people call it increase by association. And they're correct in this respect. There are times that Yahweh will connect you with someone, and that connection brings increase into your life. We have an example of it here, Abraham and Lot. Another example of it would be Elisha was just plowing with 2 yoke of oxen when Elijah walked by and threw his mantle on him. Well, his increase in his life wasn't going to come from plowing those oxen. His increase was going to come from that connection to that man. And he connected to that man that day and couldn't be shaken free from him. Even though there were times Elijah tried to shake him free. Couldn't. Elisha understood increase by association. Contrast that with Elisha, who had one with him named Gehazi. Gehazi did not understand this concept of increase by association. He did not understand the value of that relationship and that connection. He allowed his self to be turned by thinking about, he thought silver and gold and clothing were more important than that connection. He chose that and he lost everything, right? So Lot's basically doing the same thing here that Gehazi did. If he had valued his connection to Abraham, then when he first heard of the strife that was going on between the herdsmen, he would have taken a Barney Fife approach, which is what? Nip it in the bud. He'd have put a stop to it the first time he heard of it, but he didn't. That we ignore, we actually are condoning, right? Lot is not only responsible for his own life and his own decisions, but he's also responsible for how his men represent him. Well, he's shirking that responsibility. By ignoring their misdeeds, he's condoning their behavior. So here are two lessons we can learn from the wrong done by this righteous man. Number one, when we know there's a connection that Yahweh has made for us with someone else for our benefit, protect that connection with all diligence. Watch for little things that arise to try and break the connection. Once it's broken, it's hard to repair. Number two, Lot did not and was not correcting bad behavior in those he had authority over. That will always be detrimental. If you are a coach, if you're a supervisor, if you're a parent, if you have authority over anyone, if you see them doing wrong and do not correct it, you're condoning it and you're bringing grief into your life later on. Okay? So do not turn a blind eye or blink at the misdeeds of anybody under your supervision, or particularly to your children. Don't ignore it and hoping it'll go away. You see it, fix it. Okay? It's not unrighteous for you to ignore it, but it is wrong. And it'll bring harm. So 5 things Lot did wrong. Number 2 is this. He was wrong to not seek another solution than the one Abraham offered. Abraham offered this solution. Lot, you need to leave. You go to the right, I'll go to the left. You go to the left, I'll go to the right. Lot just simply accepted that instead of seeking another. That was wrong. Not at all unrighteous, wrong nonetheless. Out of respect for Lot, Abraham would not tell Lot what he should do to fix the situation. Let me say that again. Out of respect for Lot, Abraham would not tell him what he needed to do. To do so would have caused strife. It'd be easy to imagine that Lot could have and would have argued with him about it. I'm a grown man. I don't need you telling me how to run my men. I'm a grown man. I don't need you telling me what to do. You worry about your own men. I'll worry about me. Can't you see that kind of strife taking place? And Abraham was wise enough to understand that. So in his wisdom, Abraham chose a solution that he knew would appeal to Lot and would not offend Lot. He chose a solution that would cause the existing strife to cease and would not create new strife. It's not necessarily the thing he wanted. He's just trying to eliminate strife. Lot was wrong to accept that solution. What made it wrong? Number 1, this solution would separate him from the most valuable relationship that he had in the world. So it can't be a right decision if it's about to separate you from the most valuable relationship you have. Number 2, it was a solution that caused the strife with Abraham's men to cease, but it didn't fix the root of the problem. There's some unethical behavior taking place in the lives of Lot's herdsmen. You understand? And you can separate them from Abraham's herdsmen, but you still haven't dealt with what's going on in those men that's causing them to be at strife with righteous people. Right? Lot is walking away from Abraham, and Lot's walking away from Abraham with some bad men. Doesn't make him unrighteous, did make him wrong. This is where I think so many people get themselves into trouble. They think that just because they're righteous, all of their decisions will work out to their benefit, but that's not true. You can be a righteous man and make choices that are unwise. I know Romans 8:28 says that all things work together for the good to them that love Yahweh, right? But read the context. The context is that the Ruach HaKodesh is ever interceding on our behalf. You know why he has to do that? Because sometimes we don't know what to pray for. And we're in a hostile environment. And we do have that promise that all things are going to work together for our good. But it would be better for us if we prayed ourselves and humbled ourselves and thought through some of the decisions we make before we make them. Romans 8 is a promise that as long as it is not an unrighteous decision, then Yahweh is going to work it together for our good. But here's what that means. Lot was a righteous man that made 5 wrong decisions that got him in a mess. It all worked out, but it didn't work out good. By that I mean there could have been better options than the way it worked out. He had to be delivered from a city that was being destroyed. And in the process of being delivered, he lost everybody except his 2 unmarried daughters. So you can say, well, it all worked together for his good. Yeah, in that he wasn't destroyed. But things would have been better for him had he made wise decisions. In his arrogance, he accepted Abraham's terms. Listen to this. He should have given Abraham room to speak into his life. Abraham needed permission. Lot never granted him permission. Lot never gave him an opportunity. Abraham could have helped him, but he didn't ask for help. That was wrong. Number 3. He was wrong to not show respect to and defer to the man who had sustained him from a child. This is different than number 2. In number 2, he never opened the door for Abraham to be allowed to speak into his life. But in number 3, he never showed any respect to the man who had provided him with everything. Abraham had sustained him from his youth. Abraham had been a father to him. He should not have left, but if he was going to leave, then he should have deferred to Abraham and said, "Sir, I cannot and I will not choose. That would not be correct. You choose, and I'll take what you do not choose." That's what he should have done. You agree? Yes. That's what he should have done. This is nothing more than a lack of respect for Abraham. A lack of respect is not in and of itself unrighteous, but it's wrong. You remember us talking about how Abraham dealt with Ephron in Genesis 23 when he was purchasing the tomb and the field to bury Sarah? That Genesis 23 is a perfect picture of what mutual respect and high integrity looks like as you watch Ephron and Abraham negotiate this deal. What integrity and what character both of those men, what respect both of them showed to one another. Lot is displaying neither respect nor integrity. Abraham, in that deal with Ephron, would not have been unrighteous to have accepted the offer of Ephron. Yeah. What was Ephron's offer?
I'll just give it to you.
There you go. I'll just give it to you, Abraham. You can have the cave and the field. If you're going to have one, you need the other. So you can just have them both. Ephron offered. Abraham would not have been unrighteous to take that offer. But he'd have been wrong. Lot hasn't learned that lesson. Now this is a small thing, and I realize it's a tiny thing, but I think it's an example of how to, in regular, everyday life, not to make the same mistake that Lot's making. When I first moved to where I live now, I desperately wanted a garden, but I didn't have a tractor. Actually, I wanted a garden, I didn't have a field. So I had to take the trees off of it, then I had to dig up the stumps, and then I had to pick up limbs and roots and rocks. It was quite a task. And then I had a very old, very used front tine tiller. And that's how I made my first garden. And not just there, but Mandan Dave had some property, and it was about 10 times harder than my property, but I made a garden over there too. And I did it all with a tiller. And to put things in perspective, I could have done in 30 minutes with a garden tractor what it took me days to do with a front tine tiller. It was hard work. One spring after my first garden, I was down in Odenville talking to my dad and his brother, my Uncle Charles. And Uncle Charles was a good man, a man I had the utmost respect and admiration for. We had just been sitting around talking about everything, but I stood up to leave, and Uncle Charles asked me if I was going to have another garden this year. And I said, yes, sir, but I sure will be glad when I can get me a tractor, because doing it with a tiller, that's some hard work. Being the man that he was, he said, Steve, load up my tractor and take it home with you. Break your garden up with it. You can bring it back. And he had just recently bought a Massey Ferguson. I think it was a Massey 245, but he had just recently bought this tractor. Those of you who know that a farmer doesn't loan out his tractor. And he certainly doesn't loan it out to somebody that lives 100 miles away. I walked over to him and I said, Uncle Charles, it means the world to me that you'd offer to loan me your tractor. Shows me what kind of man you are. And Uncle Charles, I'm man enough to know that I cannot accept your offer. I have too much respect for you to do that. It just wouldn't be right. And I stuck my hand out. He looked me square in the eye, nodded his head, and shook my hand. Because even though he had offered, he knew it wasn't a wise thing. He was appreciative that I had enough respect for him to turn the offer down. Lot should have had enough respect and been enough of a man to not accept Abraham's offer. If he had any respect for Abraham at all, he would have declined and said, no, sir, it's not right. You choose. I'll take what's left. So you can be totally righteous and yet be very wrong in accepting somebody's offer. It takes wisdom to know how to navigate through life. This decision by Lot was not unrighteous, but it was wrong and it hurt Lot. Somebody should have told him, stop doing that. Number 4, Lot was wrong to focus on the material over the spiritual. Look back at verses 10 and 11. Lot lifted up his eyes and beheld all the plain of Jordan. It was well watered everywhere, like the garden of YAHWEH. He chose, verse 11 says, all the plain of Jordan. Journeyed east and they separated themselves. You know, we spent 12 weeks looking at Genesis 13:2, talking about how we need to believe YAHWEH to prosper us, and we should. But money and riches cannot be allowed to make decisions for us. You cannot serve YAHWEH and Mammon. Lot was blinded by the wealth possibilities he saw in the plains of Jordan and in the cities of those plains. He did not go into Sodom to participate in their wickedness. He went to participate in their commerce. He found buyers for his merchandise, buyers who would pay premium price for his wool and for his meat. He saw pastures that would increase his flocks and increase his profit. So his decision was solely based on material gain, and no thought was given to the spiritual ramifications of what he was about to do. Yeshua said, what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and lose his own soul? But also, we could say, what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and lose his connection to Abraham? What does it profit a man to gain the whole world and lose his family? There's no profit in that. Lot did not sin. He was righteous in all that he did, but he was wrong in 5 decisions. The age-old question is, why did the righteous suffer? Well, sometimes we've got to be honest and just admit, because sometimes they make wrong decisions. That's why. And they bring it on themselves. It's been true in my life more times than I care to recall. Every decision we make has ripple effects in the future. Therefore, we have to walk in wisdom and allow wisdom to navigate us through every decision that we make. Now, how does that apply? Decisions we make cannot be made with us only thinking, will this bring me financial increase? If that's our only consideration, we're about to make a wrong decision. Decisions cannot be made simply based on the fact, will this bring me joy and happiness? If that's our only consideration, then we're making a wrong decision. There has to be a spiritual component included. How will this decision affect the spiritual atmosphere that I provide for my family, and how will it affect my own spiritual development? We should pursue material things that bring increase and bring joy, but not at the expense of that which is spiritual in nature. We have to keep the spiritual at the forefront. The fifth wrong that he did. Lot was wrong to go to Sodom. He was wrong to go into the cities. He was wrong to live in Sodom. He's not breaking Torah. He did not do anything that was unrighteous. But yet it wasn't wise and it was wrong. Genesis 13:12 says this, Abraham dwelled in the land of Canaan. Lot dwelled in the cities of the plain and pitched his tent toward or as far as Sodom. He lived in Sodom. The word translated dwelled, Lot dwelled in the cities. That word can also be translated and actually means married. Lot married himself to those cities. He had great wealth living in the country. But he came into those cities and he entered into some deals and some contracts that caused him to be married to them. He's no longer a man simply enjoying his wealth. He is a man who's made commitments that require more than he needed to actually give. His decision to do this did not make him unrighteous, but it made him wrong. How do we know that he was wrong in these decisions? All we have to do is look at what it cost him. Well, here's where the problem and the warning arises. Lot made one bad decision, and that led to another bad decision, which led to another bad decision. And he stacked bad decision on top of bad decision until he had made 5 bad decisions. And once he had stacked all 5 of them together, the ultimate toll was him losing everything. And that means that he had time to contemplate the other 4 and to reverse them or correct them if he had wanted to, but he never did. He just kept moving in the direction that led him to Sodom. He could have prevented his family from being destroyed if he had been willing to honestly evaluate the choices he is making. Which brings us to my conclusion on the subject. We need to be willing to examine our own lives in these 5 areas. Number 1, are we taking responsibility to properly guide those who are under our authority? Number 2, are we taking precautions to guard connections that Yahweh has brought into our life? Number 3, are we showing proper respect to those with whom we have divine connections? Number 4, are we seeking first the kingdom of heaven, or are we seeking first that of the material world? Number 5, are we allowing ourselves to become married to our profession to the point that it endangers family? If the answer is yes to any of those, then we need to make adjustments and corrections before they continue. Being righteous does not guarantee that we'll always be right in every decision. That's why the Bible says, if any of you lacks wisdom, what's he to do? Ask. And when we ask, what does the Bible say Yahweh will do? He'll let you have a little bit. He gives liberally and upbraids not. In other words, we can go to him with something so simple, the answer ought to be obvious, but Yahweh won't upbraid us for asking. He's glad that we ask because he can see far into the future. He sees everything. And so he will gladly give us wisdom and he will not upbraid us. He can make sure that We do not choose wrong. So don't stack bad decision on top of bad decision. Be willing to always examine, reevaluate, and make course corrections where necessary. I quoted James 3 a while ago, which says that where there's envying and strife, there's confusion in every evil work. We need to keep that in mind when we look at Lot's life. Lot's first decision should have been to deal with the strife, but he never dealt with the strife. He made 5 decisions that were totally separate from the strife. Abraham dealt with the strife. He eliminated it out of his home, out of his holdings. Lot never dealt with the strife that was coming from his men. Where there is envying and strife, there is what? Confusion and every evil work. Because he didn't deal with the root of the problem, which was the strife. Instead, he made 5 decisions that he hoped would lead to blessings in his life. The evil and the confusion and every evil work followed him. That's the reason it was easy for him to make 5 bad decisions, one on top of the other. And what is evil? Lack, want, distress, sickness, and disease. He opened the door for all 5 of those things to attack him. Whereas if he on that day when Abraham brought it up had dealt with Yahweh, sir, you don't have to worry about this anymore, Abraham. I'll have a meeting with my men now. You won't ever have another problem out of them, I assure you. Had he dealt with that, the end of Lot's life would have been a lot different than what we read about. Where there's envying and strife, ignore it and end up like Lot. Where there's envying and strife, deal with it and end up like Abraham. Simple enough. We want to be righteous. Yes? Yes. We want to walk in Torah. But we also want to realize that just because we're walking in Torah doesn't mean we can't make wrong decisions. So we want to be righteous and right in our decision making. And that takes the wisdom of Yahweh. So I just said in 30 seconds what it took me 45 minutes to say earlier. Yahweh bless you and keep you. Yahweh make His face shine upon you and be gracious to you. Yahweh lift up His countenance upon you and give you shalom. As His name is put upon you, so shall He bless you.